So my paper examines the issue of the impact of tax incentives on school districts. Well, local governments in the United States often use this type of incentive in where they abate the property taxes for corporations and businesses, and to get them to encourage them to invest in their localities or in places that normally do not attract a lot of capital investments. It's a way of boosting economic growth in an area, and it's usually place targeted, or it's targeted at a specific industry. There's a very definite purpose. But fiscally, that means a bunch of overlapping jurisdictions would forego the revenues that are being abated. So basically, the companies get sort of the tax benefits, which help make it more profitable for them to invest. But then the trade-off for the local government is that they collect less tax revenues that year. So school districts tend to feel the heaviest impact because they, well, for two reasons. One is that they depend a lot on property tax, or most of them do. On average, I think nationwide, property tax accounts for about 30%, and it's the largest single source of revenue for most school districts, or for the typical school district. The second reason that is because education is the most expensive public services in most places, school districts also get the largest share of the property taxes that are levied or collected, and so they're also more prone to the impact of property tax abatements. Starting in 2017, a lot of local governments, and that includes school districts, started reporting how much revenue they either forego or they either abated or had to forego because of other local governments abating the taxes. And basically, so school districts, they have to report their portion of the revenues foregone. And this was only starting in 2017, so it's very new. It provided researchers with a wealth of information, even though the data is still incomplete, which is why my paper only picked the 9 states where the data is very comprehensive and reliable. But still, it's just a wealth of information on sort of like the social cost of tax incentives and how public services are affected in particular. What's special about this data is that essentially it takes all these business incentives agreements for which you have like kind of how much taxes were abated for this particular corporation. What it did is that it divided that up into its by so jurisdiction specific cost. And so we know exactly how much school districts are affected. So the paper basically runs regression models on to examine the relationship using district as observations to see if school finances are in fact affected by the use of tax incentives. And all of this data is being maintained by Good Jobs First in its online database called Tax Break Tracker. And so definitely encourage people to check that out. It's a great resource. And so far, the largest collection of these tax abatement disclosures. The main finding of this paper is that tax abatements have a significant negative association with school finances generally. Some of the finer findings are that school districts serving disadvantaged students, so students from historically disadvantaged races, or students who are eligible for the free or reduced price lunch program, which is a very accurate measure for student poverty for a district. So these districts tend to experience greater burden from tax abatements, and this is not totally unexpected because tax abatements are usually targeted at places that need this kind of a state intervention to draw in investment and jobs. It's not quite so straightforward either, because some wealthier districts, because they rely less on state aid and they levy a lot of taxes themselves, so they also must absorb, if they abate taxes or their local governments abate taxes, they must absorb a lot of the fiscal burden from property tax abatements without the state aid to offset it. And finally, tax abatement burden is associated with greater extent or more severe kind of underfunding. And this is a measure developed by these researchers at Rutgers University that essentially measure how much you need to spend per student for a district to be adequately funded. Basically, to sum it all up, it's not just the poor, disadvantaged school districts that are affected, but everybody is affected in different ways. Policymakers must be very careful with using tax incentives. They must be very judicious with these instruments, which when used properly would drive, would stimulate economic growth, would bring in new jobs, and without hurting the public services too much in the process. But when misused or overused, they can seriously damage the fiscal health of local governments and school districts in particular. Probably the best policy recommendation is to simply shield school district revenues from abatement. So considering that education is so important for long-term sustainable economic development, so it's really important to just safeguard the revenues that were earmarked, because these revenues were set aside to ensure that students get the resources they need. And so that should just be taken off the table during incentive negotiations.